I have told this story once before tonight. I told it to my brother Gerald on the phone last spring, and he listened all the way through without interrupting, which is not something Gerald does. When I finished, he was quiet for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "Hank, I believe you." That was all. I have been trying to figure out what to do with this story ever since, and I have decided the only thing to do with it is tell it plain, and let people make of it what they will. I am not a person who believes in things I cannot explain. I want to be clear about that before anything else. 31 years carrying mail on a rural route in eastern Tennessee will train you to look at the world in a particular way. You learn to notice when something is different from yesterday, and you learn to find the reason, because on a route like mine, the reasons mattered. A mailbox flag left up when it was always down meant Mrs. Greer's arthritis was bad and she needed someone to check. A tire rut through a front yard that wasn't there on Tuesday meant the Finch boy had come home without calling anyone. You read the land and the patterns, and you stay inside what you can account for. That was my life for 31 years. Then Ruth died, and the things I could account for got considerably smaller. She went on a Tuesday in late October, 14 months before the November I am about to describe. A stroke, and a quick one. And I was grateful for quick when the grief let me be grateful for anything. We had been together 38 years. I retired from the route 6 weeks after her funeral because I could not make myself drive past her sister's house on Clearwater Road any more than I had to. And once I stopped driving the route, I stopped leaving the property much at all. The property is 43 acres in the foothills east of Sevierville. My father Dale farmed every inch of it his whole life and left it to me when he passed, 22 years ago. He was not a man who said much, my father. He was a landkeeper in the old sense, the kind of man who knew what the soil wanted before he asked it for anything. He used to say, when I was a boy and then later when I was grown and should have known better than to dismiss things, that something watched over that land. He did not say it like a man telling a ghost story. He said it the way he'd say the north field drains slow after a hard rain. Just a fact he had noticed. There was a Saturday in the summer of 1971 when I was 11, and we were repairing a section of split-rail fence along the south pasture, my father with the heavy maul, and me with the awkward second pair of hands he had been teaching to be useful, and he stopped midway through driving a chestnut post and pulled his cap off his head and looked across the field toward the cedar breaks for what felt to me like a long time. The cicadas were going hard in the elm trees behind us. The smell of the oil he had used on the maul was strong in the heat. He set the cap back on and said, "Hank, you watch this place when I am gone." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You watch it, and you keep up the ritual things your mother does. The salt block at the corner, and the corn at the cedar stump, and the buckwheat she sows on the upper bench in May. You keep all of that going whether or not you understand why she does it." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "This land is being watched, son, and I am not the first generation that has known it. I do not have a way to prove that to you. I am telling it to you so it gets to the next generation in the way I got it from my father." I had nodded the way an 11-year-old nods at things his father says without taking them entirely on board, and I had filed it the way a boy files things he expects to revisit later. I revisited it that November morning at the stump 54 years later, and I revisited it again 3 days after that when the bark and the berries appeared, and I have been revisiting it steadily ever since. There are things a man hands his son in plain sentences at the back end of a hot July day that the son does not pick up correctly until 40 years have gone past, and the original speaker is in the ground. My father knew this. He told me anyway. That is one of the things I've only recently understood about him. I heard it as poetry. I thought he meant the land itself, the way it sustained you if you treated it right. I thought he was speaking in the language of old farmers, which tends toward the metaphorical when it tends toward anything. I was wrong about that, and I am getting to why. Ruth had a ritual she kept every morning from April through November, and then on any morning in winter when the cold wasn't absolute. She would take a shallow clay dish out to the old cedar stump at the east edge of the field, a stump my father never pulled because he said it was the oldest thing on the property and deserved to stay. And she would fill the dish with water from a mason jar she carried, and scatter a handful of seed corn around the base of the stump and sometimes in the dish itself. She said it was for the birds and the squirrels, and it was, and cardinals and tufted titmice and fox squirrels worked that stump all through every season she kept the habit. But I think she also did it because she liked having a reason to walk to the far edge of the field every morning before the day started. She liked standing there and looking back at the house from that distance. I kept the ritual after she died. I cannot explain it better than that. The first morning after I came home from her sister's house, I found the dish on the kitchen counter where Ruth always left it to dry, and I filled it from the mason jar in the cabinet, and I walked out to the stump, and I set the dish and scattered the corn, and I stood there looking back at the house the way she used to. I did it the next morning, and the morning after that. By the time the first real frost came, I had done it every morning for 3 weeks, and it had become the thing that got me out of bed. I did it through the winter, even when the ground was iron hard, because stopping felt like a second death I was not ready for. Amos came with me every morning. He is a beagle, 12 years old that November, with a face so white it looks like he has been eating flour. Ruth picked him out of a litter a neighbor had advertised on a flyer at the hardware store, back when he was small enough to sit in one of her coat pockets. He was her dog the way she would admit Amos was her dog and not mine, which is to say he slept on her side of the bed and came to her first, and always. After she died, he transferred that attachment to me with a thoroughness that I found both touching and quietly devastating. He followed me to the stump every morning and sat at my feet while I stood there, and he never seemed to mind the cold or the early dark of those winter mornings, which told me he was keeping a ritual of his own. If you have found your way to this story, I would ask you to stay with it a while. I know how it sounds from the outside. I know what kind of man I seem like before I get to what happened, and I know what I sounded like to myself when it started. If that kind of doubt is part of what you carry, I think you will understand the way this went. And if you want to make sure you don't miss what comes next, there's a subscribe button somewhere nearby, and I would be glad of the company. The anomalies began in early November, not on a dramatic morning, not with any fanfare. They began the way everything on a property begins, quietly and in the corners of things you are almost not paying attention to. The first thing I noticed was the birds. I had been watching that stump every morning for 14 months, and I knew exactly what arrived and when. The fox squirrel came first, usually just after first light, and worked the corn while the sky was still grey. The cardinals came next, the males brilliant even in November light. And after them, the small brown birds I had never bothered to name but could recognise by the way they moved. By 8 in the morning on any given November day, the stump had been visited and the corn was mostly gone, and the yard had settled back into its ordinary quiet. On the 4th of November, a Wednesday, I walked out at my usual time, and the stump was empty. Not the emptiness of the corn being gone, the emptiness of nothing having come at all. The dish was full as I had left it. The corn was scattered around the base exactly as I had placed it. The squirrel had not come. The cardinals had not come. The small brown birds had not come. The stump sat in the grey morning light like something had told every creature on the property to stay away from it. I stood there for a while looking at it. Then I looked at the tree line. The cedars and hemlocks that mark the east edge of the property are dense enough at that distance that they read as a single dark wall from the house side, maybe 120 yards away across the open field. I looked at that wall, and I did not see anything in it, and I told myself that a cold front had come through in the night, and the birds had not yet adjusted, which is a thing that happens. I told myself that, and I walked back to the house with Amos at my heels. Thursday morning, the same. The dish sat full on the stump. The corn was undisturbed, no birds, no squirrel. Amos sat at the stump's base and pointed his white nose toward the tree line, not with the urgency of a dog who has caught something alarming, but with the slow, methodical attention of an old dog who has picked up a thread he is not sure he recognizes. His tail hung low and easy. His ears were up. He stayed in that position for longer than he usually sat still for anything. I looked at the tree line again. I checked the field for tracks and did not find any that I had not made myself. I told myself that the first cold snap had pushed whatever small animals remained on this side of the ridge deeper into the woods for warmth, which is also a thing that happens. I went back to the house. I ate breakfast and did not taste it. Friday morning, I found something in the dish. It was a handful of dried service berries, dark and wizened, the kind that have been on the bush since September. Someone or something had placed them in the dish. Not scattered around the stump the way the corn was, but set carefully inside the rim of the dish, as if whoever left them understood what the dish was for. The corn I had put out the morning before was still around the base of the stump, untouched, and the service berries were in the dish where the water should have been. I stood there for a long time. I'm not sure how long. Amos put his front feet up on the stump and sniffed the berries carefully, and then lowered himself back to the ground and looked at me with the expression he used when he wanted me to account for something. I went through every explanation I had. A person from the neighbouring property would have had to cross 2 fence lines and a creek to get to the stump, and there was no reason for anyone to do that, and no tracks in the frost to suggest they had. A bird could not have assembled a collection of berries in a dish. A fox squirrel carries individual items in its mouth, not a cupped arrangement of a dozen. I stood there and I went through every category I had, and each one failed. And at the end of that exercise, I was left with something I did not have a word for, and which I carried back to the house, like an extra weight in my coat. I want to say something here, and I mean it plainly. I am the kind of man who has gone his whole life not needing the world to be larger than what he can see and account for. I was not looking for anything. I was not in the kind of grief that makes a person desperate for signs. I was in the kind of grief that has settled into the routine, the kind that does not hurt sharply anymore, but has become the shape of ordinary life, the way a fence post that has leaned 1 degree for 20 years eventually just looks like what a fence post is. I was not expecting anything from that stump or that field or that tree line. I want to be clear about that. That afternoon, I went out to the barn to split some kindling I had been putting off. I tried to keep 2 weeks of kindling ahead of what the stove needs, and I had let it slip to 4 days. I was at the splitting block for maybe an hour, working by feel more than by thought, the way you do a job you have done 10,000 times. And somewhere in the middle of it, I became aware that the tree line was quiet in a way it had not been earlier. Not the quiet of nothing happening, the quiet of something large holding itself still. I know the sounds of that tree line the way I knew every mailbox on my route. A light wind in November cedars is a particular sound, a soft fraying at the edges of silence. The crows that roost in the hemlocks on the east side have 3 calls I can distinguish. The creek below the property makes a specific pitch in low water that changes to a deeper sound when the water is up. I had been listening to that tree line my whole life, and the silence that settled over it that Friday afternoon was not any of those things. I set the maul down against the splitting block. I did not reach for it again. Amos had been lying in a patch of thin sun near the barn door, the way he always did when I was working outside, and he was no longer lying down. He was standing with his body pointed at the tree line, that same low, easy tail, that same lifting of the ears, that same complete stillness. He was not growling. He was not even trembling, the way younger dogs will when they've caught something that excites them. He was just attending to something at the tree line with the seriousness of an old animal who has gotten past the noise of his own reactions. I watched the tree line for a while. I did not see anything move. The light was coming down fast the way it does in November, when the sky is overcast, dropping from grey to darker grey without any real golden hour between. And I told myself the bad light was playing with the depth of the shadows in the cedar breaks, which happens. I picked up the kindling and carried it inside and did not go back out until morning, Saturday, the fourth morning since the birds had stopped coming. I did not sleep well. I am not sure I slept at all after 2 in the morning. I lay in the dark on my side of the bed and listened to Amos breathing at the foot of it and watched the ceiling. At some point around 4, I got up and put water on for coffee and stood at the kitchen window in the dark. The field was not visible, but I knew where the stump was. I had been walking to it every morning for 14 months, and I knew its position the way I knew where each piece of furniture was in the dark house I had lived in for 30 years. I was dressed and out the door by first light, earlier than usual. Amos came with me, moving slow the way he does in cold weather, his arthritic back legs carrying him at a careful pace across the frozen grass. The sky was the colour of old pewter, and the field was stiff with frost. My breath came out white and disappeared. I walked to the stump. The dish held service berries again. More of them this time. A full dish of them, the dark little berries packed in neatly. And beside the dish, on the flat surface of the stump, was a length of cedar bark, stripped clean, the pale inner side facing up. I do not know what the bark meant. I am not sure it meant anything I would understand. But the berries in the dish I understood, at least in the sense that I understood the dish was being answered, the way a letter gets answered, the way a gesture of one kind calls up a gesture of the same kind in return. I looked at the tree line, and I saw at the edge of the cedars where the field grass meets the first of the timber, something that I watched for long enough that I could not call it a trick of the light, and stay honest with myself. It was large. It was very large in the way that recalibrates your sense of scale for what can stand upright on 2 legs. It was at the border between the trees and the open field, partly inside the shadow of the cedars. And it was still the way an animal is still when it has decided not to move, rather than when it has not noticed you. The difference is something you feel in your chest more than you see with your eyes. It had been watching me. Amos walked to the stump, sniffed the bark and the berries, and then sat down in the frost and looked toward the tree line with that same steady, unalarmed attention. He did not bark. He did not whine. He angled his white muzzle toward the tree line and sat there like a dog who is watching something he has watched before and is not afraid of. That is what made me stay. I want to say that plainly because people sometimes assume it was courage or curiosity that kept me from turning and going back inside. It was not. It was an old beagle who had seen more of grief than most dogs ever see, and who was sitting in the frost looking at the tree line like it was a perfectly ordinary Saturday morning. If Amos was calm, I could be calm. That was the whole of my reasoning. The creature stepped out of the shadow of the cedars. I am going to tell this part carefully because I have thought about every word of it for months, and I do not want to say anything I am not sure of. It walked upright. It was at least 8 feet tall and perhaps more than that, the kind of height that you measure against the cedar trees beside it, because your mind refuses to take the measurement any other way. It was covered in dark fur, not black, but the very deep brown of river mud in shadow. Its arms were long in a proportion that was not a man's proportion. Its shoulders were wide in a way that made the cedar trees beside it look like saplings. It was not threatening. I cannot say it more simply than that. The way it moved into the open was the way a person walks out onto their own porch in the morning, deliberate and calm, and entirely at home. It crossed the field toward the stump. I did not move. I am not sure I breathed with any regularity during what happened next. It came across the frost-covered grass with a slowness that was intentional, each step placed with care, as if it understood that moving carefully was a language I might be able to read. It stopped perhaps 15 feet from the stump. It looked at me. I looked at it. The eyes were dark brown, close in colour to the fur, and they were quiet in a way that I have been trying to find words for ever since. Not empty, not threatening. Attending. That is the closest word I have. They were attending to me the way my father used to attend to a piece of ground he was deciding how to work, the specific, focused patience of something that has been watching long enough to understand what it is looking at. It looked at me for a long moment. Then it looked at the stump. Then it looked at me again. It reached into the grass at the edge of the stump with one enormous hand, and it picked up the clay dish, and it held it for a moment in fingers that could have held it the way I would hold a thimble. It set the dish back on the flat top of the stump, and then reached into the fur at its chest, and I understood then that it had been carrying something, cradled there against the warmth. It brought out a small cluster of dried berries, service berries still on a short section of stem, and it placed them in the dish with a care that I have no other word for but care. It arranged them. It set them in the center of the dish the way you would set something down for someone you expected to find it. I do not know what broke open in me in that moment. I know it had been sealed for 14 months. I know that Ruth used to stand at that stump every morning and look back at the house, and I had been doing it in her place without ever once feeling like anything had noticed or cared that I was doing it. I know that I had been living in the 43 acres of my father's land, like a man who has lost the reason for being in a place he has no intention of leaving. I am not going to say that what happened next was crying, exactly. It was not the kind of thing you can name cleanly. It was the feeling of something that has been held rigid for a very long time releasing all at once, and I stood at that stump with my hands at my sides and let it go. The creature watched me. It did not move toward me, and it did not move away. It stood at its full height in the pale November light, 15 feet away, and it watched me with those attending eyes until whatever I needed to let go of was let go. And then, without any ceremony and without any hurry, it turned and walked back across the field toward the tree line. Each step the same careful deliberateness as before. At the edge of the cedars, it paused. It did not look back. It simply stopped for a moment, and then the darkness of the tree line absorbed it, and it was gone. Amos walked to the stump, sniffed the berries in the dish, and then came and sat on my boot. He sat there for a while, and I put my hand on his back. The field was very quiet. The sky had gone from pewter to a pale, watery gold in the east, the kind of light that does not last, and I stood in it and watched the tree line until the gold was gone and the grey came back. I walked to the house. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at my hands for a long time. The next morning, I called Calvin. He lives in Knoxville now, works in commercial property management, and we had not spoken in 8 months. The estrangement, if I am being honest, was mostly a thing that happened to us, rather than a thing either of us chose. After Ruth died, I went inward in a way that left no room for other people, and Calvin called twice, and I answered with short sentences, and he stopped calling, and I let him stop. I had been meaning to call him back for 8 months and had not done it, and had not been able to say why exactly, except that making the call felt like admitting something I was not ready to admit. I dialed his number and he picked up on the 3rd ring and said, "Dad?" I said, "Hey, Calvin." And then I did not say anything else for a moment. He said, "You okay?" I said, "I'm not sure. I wanted to call. I should have called before now." He said, "Yeah." I said, "I know." There was a pause and he said, "You want to come down for Thanksgiving?" I said, "I think I would if that's still open." He said, "It's open, Dad. It's always been open." I did not say anything to that because there was not anything I could say that would not take longer than I had words for right then. I said I would drive down the Tuesday before. He said, "Okay." We said goodbye, and I sat with the receiver in my hand for a while after the call ended, and Amos came and put his chin on my knee, and I told him we were going to Knoxville in 3 weeks. I did go to Knoxville. Calvin met me in the driveway, and we stood there for a moment, not quite knowing how to stand together, and then he put one arm around my shoulder and I let him, and that was as far as we got that first evening. And it was enough. We ate Thanksgiving dinner with his wife and his 2 boys, my grandsons who I had not seen since Ruth's funeral. And after dinner, I sat in Calvin's living room and watched his youngest show me something on a handheld game. And I felt, for the first time in 14 months, like I was inside my own life rather than watching it from the far side of the field. I told Calvin some of what had happened when we were alone in the kitchen washing up. Not all of it. I told him about the dish and the berries and the thing I had seen at the tree line, and he listened without interrupting, which is Calvin's way when he is taking something seriously. When I finished, he dried his hands on a dish towel and said, "Grandad used to say something about that land." I said, "I knew." He said, "You think he knew?" I said, "I thought my father might have known more than he said, which, for my father, would have been considerable." And Calvin nodded and folded the dish towel over the oven handle, and we left it at that. I drove home the following Sunday. The property looked like itself. The field was dead and dormant the way November fields are in East Tennessee, and the stump sat at its far edge with the clay dish on top of it. I had left the dish out when I went to Knoxville, which I would not have done before. I refilled the mason jar and walked out across the field on a grey morning with Amos behind me, and I put water in the dish and scattered the corn, and I stood at the stump and looked back at the house. The birds came back that same week, the fox squirrel, the cardinals, the small brown ones. They came back to the stump in their usual order and worked the corn the same as always, and the field settled into its winter patterns and stayed there. I did not see the creature again. I did not find anything in the dish again. But I will tell you that I looked at the tree line every morning that I walked out, and there was something about looking at it that was different from before. Not comfort exactly. Not the comfort of knowing you are safe. Something quieter than that. The sense that what is on the other side of the tree line is not indifferent. That whatever lives in the dark timber past the cedar breaks has been attending to this 43 acres for longer than my father had it, and longer than his father before him, and that it pays a kind of attention that does not require you to understand it or deserve it. I think about my father when I walk out there now. I think about the particular way he said what he said about the land being watched, that plain declarative tone he used for facts that he had verified personally and seen no reason to argue about. He was not a superstitious man. He was not given to poetry or to wishful thinking. He was the kind of man who could tell you the drainage characteristics of every field on his property by touch, who kept a written record of first frost dates going back to 1961, who fixed fence by himself in January because the fence needed fixing and he was the one who was there. He was not the kind of man who used a word like watched without meaning it precisely. I had the phrase wrong for all those years. I heard watched over and I unpacked it as metaphor, as the romantic idea that the land sustained you if you sustained it. The way you might say, the mountains have been here a long time and will be here after you. I did not take the word watched in its plain meaning. I did not think he meant there was something in the timber paying attention to what happened at the stump and who refilled the dish and how long a man stood at the field's edge alone before he turned and went back inside. He meant exactly that. That is the part of this that I carry differently now, 8 months on from that November morning. I carry it the way you carry a tool that has been in your family for a long time, something whose weight you know so well, it feels like part of your hand. I do not talk about it often. I told Gerald, I told Calvin some of it. I am telling it now to whoever has stayed with me this long, because I have been looking for the right place to put it down, and I think this might be it. I do not know what the creature was. I have turned it over in my mind from every angle I know how to use, and I have not arrived at a category that covers it. I am not going to pretend otherwise. What I know is what I saw, and what I saw was an animal of extraordinary size and deliberateness that had been watching the ritual at that stump long enough to understand what the dish was for, and that placed something in it with a care that I can only call intentional. Whether it understood why I was out there every morning, whether it had any sense of what the ritual cost me, I cannot say. I am not able to get inside that. I know what its eyes looked like from 15 feet away, and I know that looking at them, I did not feel like something that was about to be harmed. I felt like something that was being witnessed. 8 months out, it is late July. The field is in its summer state, the grass tall between the old fence lines, the cedar stump barely visible from the house in the growth. Amos moves slower than he did in November, which I expected. He still comes with me to the stump every morning. He still sits at my feet while I fill the dish and scatter the corn, and he still points his white nose at the tree line with that particular attention, that low, easy tail, that stillness that is not alarm but something closer to recognition. I do not know what he hears or smells in those moments. I have stopped needing to know. I called Calvin last week just to call. We talked for half an hour about nothing urgent. His boys, the summer heat in Knoxville, a fuel pump I was replacing on my truck. He is coming up in August with the boys, and we are going to build a section of fence along the north field that I have been putting off for 2 years. I have the posts already cut and stacked in the barn. I have been putting off a lot of things for a long time, and I am done putting them off. My father used to say that something watched over that land, and I thought he meant it the way people mean things when they want to say something true without saying it plainly. He meant it plainly. He meant it the way he meant everything. And whatever has been out there in the timber past the cedar breaks for longer than I can account for, whatever left dried service berries in a clay dish on a flat cedar stump at the edge of a 43-acre field in November, whatever looked at me with those attending eyes and waited until I had let go of the thing I had been holding since October a year before, it is still out there. I am certain of it. I do not find that frightening. Amos is at my feet on the porch as I write this, the way he was at my feet every cold morning that first winter, the way he sat on my boot in the frost while the light came back into the sky. He is not going to be with me a great deal longer, and I know that, and I am trying to let knowing it be the thing that makes me pay attention to this evening and not the thing that makes me dread the next one. He is asleep now. his chin on my boot the way it was on my knee, that morning after the phone call, and the stump is visible at the field's edge in the long July light, the clay dish on top of it, catching the last of the sun. My father was right.